They called him the corporate raider of the tropics, a man who could turn borrowed money into private jets, luxury towers, and the illusion of limitless wealth. And for a while it worked. From the outside, Christopher Skase looked less like a businessman and more like a preview of the future, tanned, immaculate, permanently in motion, moving through boardrooms and hotel lobbies with the confidence of someone who seemed to know where the world was going before everyone else did. He was selling a dream Australia wanted to believe in, bigger deals, bigger property empires, bigger ambition. A country that had spent decades on the edge of global finance suddenly had its own larger-than-life empire builder. That was the seduction. Because the more impossible it all looked, the more people leaned in. Quintex did not present itself as a warning. It presented itself as proof. Proof that scale could be manufactured. Proof that momentum could replace caution. Proof that if confidence was high enough, reality might simply move out of the way. And everywhere people looked, there seemed to be evidence. Towers, hotels, media assets, expansion, prestige, deals stacked on top of deals until the entire machine felt too large, too visible, too celebrated to be fragile. Banks lent, investors followed, politicians noticed. The press amplified the myth. In the age of excess, Christopher Skase did not look like an outlier. He looked perfectly timed. That is what made the danger so difficult to see. Because collapses like this rarely begin with panic. They begin with applause, with admiration, with a public mood that mistakes speed for strength. The empire appears polished. The numbers appear to move in the right direction. The rooms get louder, the suits get sharper, and somewhere underneath all that noise, something essential starts to rot. Very quietly. Not in a way the public could easily identify. Not at first. There was no single dramatic revelation in the beginning, no obvious confession, no smoking gun placed neatly on the table. What existed instead was a feeling, a growing contradiction that almost nobody wanted to say out loud. How was all of this being held together? That question lingered at the edge of the spectacle, but it kept getting drowned out by the spectacle itself. Because in boom years, doubt feels unsophisticated, skepticism feels small, and a man like Skase knew exactly how to use that. He understood something deeper than accounting. He understood theater. That was the first twist. Quintex was not just expanding through assets and debt and corporate strategy. It was expanding through image, through status, through the psychological pressure that success exerts on anyone watching from the outside. If a man appears powerful enough, connected enough, untouchable enough, people stop asking whether the structure is sound. They start asking how they can get closer to it. And suddenly this was no longer just the story of one flamboyant executive and one ambitious company. It was becoming a story about a financial culture that had learned to reward appearances before substance. A culture so intoxicated by prestige that it mistook the performance of strength for the thing itself. That should have been enough to slow everything down. It did not. It accelerated. Because as Quintex grew, so did the pressure to keep growing. A machine built on expansion cannot easily admit limits. The lifestyle has to be maintained. The confidence has to be projected. The next acquisition has to arrive before the last question becomes too loud. And when that happens, growth stops being a sign of health. It becomes a form of concealment. That was the second break in the rhythm. The empire was not merely getting bigger. It may have needed to get bigger. Every new layer created more admiration, more complexity, more distance between the public image and whatever lay underneath it, more moving parts, more reasons for outsiders to assume that someone else had surely checked the foundations. But who had? Banks saw prestige. Investors saw momentum. The public saw glamour. And inside that widening gap between what people saw and what was actually there, risk began to mutate into something far more dangerous. Dependence on confidence, on fresh financing, on the next deal, on the next headline, on the idea that tomorrow would always arrive before scrutiny did. Then another shadow entered the story. Because Quintex was not just playing in ordinary business circles. As its ambitions spread through property, media, and luxury assets, it moved closer to the fault lines of power itself, where regulators, lenders, executives, and public influence could blur into something murkier. The empire's visibility made it look safer. In reality, visibility was becoming its shield. The bigger the name, the harder it was for people to imagine the collapse. No one wants to believe that a company splashed across skylines and newspaper pages could be running on something unstable. No one wants to believe that a man hosted by elites and treated like a symbol of national success might be standing on a surface far thinner than it appeared. So the questions came late, and when they did come, they did not arrive as a clean moral awakening. They arrived as whispers, liquidity concerns, strange pressure points, deals that looked less reassuring the longer you stared at them. A sense that the empire's elegance might depend on something more brittle than anyone had admitted. Something hidden, not because it was invisible, but because too many powerful people had an interest in not looking too closely. By then, the illusion had become expensive, not just financially, psychologically, institutionally, reputationally. Too many people had believed. Too many careers had aligned with the myth. Too much money had already crossed the table. And that is when stories like this become truly dangerous. When truth is no longer just inconvenient, but destructive to everyone who helped sustain the fantasy. Christopher Skase had built more than a company. He had built a reality that others were now trapped inside. And the moment that reality began to crack, it threatened to expose not just one man, but an entire system that had mistaken performance for value, expansion for stability, and charisma for proof. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was how long the performance could continue before the people funding it realized they were not watching an empire rise, but an implosion being delayed. By the time the first serious doubts began to spread, the danger was no longer theoretical. It was structural. Quintex had grown so fast in so many directions that the empire itself had become a kind of argument. Look at the size, it seemed to say. Look at the buildings. Look at the hotels. Look at the reach. No fragile company could possibly look this substantial. No unstable operator could possibly command this much attention. The scale was doing its own persuasion. And that was exactly the problem. Because once a company starts using its own size as evidence of its health, every new expansion stops being just a business move. It becomes reinforcement, another layer of confidence, another reason for outsiders to silence their doubts, another reason for lenders and investors to believe that whatever they cannot fully see must still be under control. But beneath that polished surface, something more intricate was beginning to emerge. Not the full truth? Not yet. Just the outline of a machine that seemed to need constant motion. Assets were not simply being accumulated. They were being used to support more borrowing, more ambitious purchases, more elaborate claims of value, until the difference between genuine strength and financial performance began to blur. Paper values created confidence. Confidence unlocked more money. More money financed more expansion. Expansion created fresh public admiration. And that admiration fed back into the paper values again. A loop, a dangerous one. At first glance, it looked like momentum. In reality, it may have been dependence disguised as success. The company did not just benefit from optimism, it increasingly relied on it. And the longer that continued, the less room there was for any interruption. A missed payment, a failed deal, a shift in credit conditions, a lender getting nervous, any one of those could do more than create discomfort. It could break the spell. That is when the story darkens. Because once a financial empire depends on confidence to survive, truth itself becomes a threat. Every question becomes dangerous. Every delay becomes loaded. Every internal weakness must be managed, deferred, smoothed over, or hidden inside something larger and more impressive. The system does not have the luxury of honesty anymore. It has to keep moving. And Christopher Skase was not the kind of man who retreated. He escalated. More glamour, more status, more projection. Private luxury was not just indulgence now. It was part of the architecture. The image of unstoppable success had become so central to the Quintex myth that personal extravagance and corporate credibility began to reinforce each other. The empire looked rich because its leader lived like a king, and he could live like a king because the empire still looked rich. But that kind of theater has a cost. It has to be financed. And somewhere in that widening gap between image and solvency, more people started asking a question that had once seemed almost impolite. Was Quintex truly generating the kind of durable value its public image suggested? Or was it becoming trapped inside a cycle where appearances had to be maintained because too much depended on them already? That question opened another one. Who exactly was keeping this alive? This was no longer just about one man's charisma or one company's ambition. It was about the institutions around him. The lenders who extended credit, the advisors who structured deals, the circles of influence that treated expansion as validation instead of warning. It is easy to focus on the flamboyant figure at the center. Harder to look at the ecosystem that made him possible. And ecosystems do not collapse all at once. They fray in private. Inside Quintex, the pressure was rising. Debt obligations do not care about mythology. Interest payments do not respond to charm. Creditors do not stay patient forever. At some point, the machine has to produce cash, not just headlines. Real resilience, not just escalating valuations. Substance, not just motion. That was where the distinction became lethal. Because the hidden system underneath Quintex was not built around one clean fraud anyone could summarize in a sentence. That is why so many people missed it. This was more dangerous than a simple lie. It was an accumulation of financial habits, dependencies, assumptions, and incentives that made the company look stronger the more fragile it became. Assets could be leveraged. Values could be presented in ways that inspired further lending. Complex structures could delay the moment when weakness became undeniable. And as long as money kept moving in, the image could survive. For a while, then came the pattern. Interrupt, no one inside the myth could fully control. The world outside the performance began to change. Credit conditions tightened. Sentiment shifted. The age of easy expansion started to lose its glow. Suddenly, the same boldness that had once looked visionary began to look exposed. The same complexity that had impressed people began to feel obscuring. The same empire that had seemed too large to fail started to look too tangled to understand. And when outsiders stop understanding a financial structure, fear arrives fast. That fear was not yet a full panic. It was more corrosive than that. It moved through banks, boardrooms, and markets as hesitation, as caution, as one more request for reassurance, one more demand for clarity, one more moment where the people on the other side of the table wanted proof instead of promise. That is when momentum can turn against itself. A machine built on growth needs fresh trust. If trust weakens, growth slows. When growth slows, the structure underneath gets harder to defend. And when it gets harder to defend, trust weakens even more. What once looked like a rising spiral becomes a tightening noose. Christopher Skase did what men like him often do when the walls begin to close in. He fought reality with narrative. He insisted. He projected certainty. He treated criticism not as evidence of danger, but as a failure of imagination. That posture can be persuasive in the early stages. It can even seem heroic. But late in the game, when creditors are nervous and cash pressure is mounting, confidence starts to look less like strength and more like defiance. And defiance is not liquidity. The hidden mechanism was finally becoming visible in fragments. Not a single secret account, not one neat trick, something broader. An empire whose expansion had become inseparable from its need for continued financing. A structure where asset values, public prestige, and borrowed money were feeding each other in a loop that looked powerful from the outside and increasingly unstable from within. But even then, the full scale of the danger was still obscured, because the public had not yet seen what happened when the flow slowed down. They had not yet seen what desperation would look like once the illusion could no longer carry itself. And they had not yet seen how far Christopher Skase was willing to go when the world that made him started to turn. Then the pressure became visible, not as a single explosion, but as a sequence of fractures that started appearing faster than the empire could cover them up. By now, Quintex was no longer just an ambitious conglomerate riding a wave of confidence. It was a structure under siege from its own design. The thing that had made it look unstoppable in the boom years was now turning against it. Complexity, leverage, constant expansion, public theater. All of it had worked beautifully when money was loose and doubt was unfashionable. But once lenders became cautious, those same qualities stopped looking like strengths. They started to look like camouflage. And camouflage only works until someone decides to stand still and really look. That was the moment the public image and the private reality began drifting too far apart to reconcile. The company still projected scale, prestige, inevitability. But inside, the pressure was becoming more primitive. Cash, deadlines, demands. The kind of pressure that strips a glamorous empire down to its bare mechanics. Not what it says it owns. Not what it says it is worth. Not how magnificent it appears from a distance. What can it pay? Now, that is where the illusion begins to die. Because a debt-fueled structure can survive bad headlines. It can survive gossip. It can even survive investigation for a while. What it cannot survive is a sudden need to prove that the wealth everyone has been admiring is liquid, durable, and real enough to satisfy the people waiting at the door. And those people were no longer whispering. They wanted answers. This is the part where many financial legends reveal their deepest weakness, not when they are attacked by enemies, when they are asked to simplify themselves, to open the books, to explain the relationship between the assets, the borrowing, the obligations, and the assumptions holding the structure together. That is when performance loses its power. Because performance thrives on motion, symbolism, and selective framing, scrutiny demands sequence, causality, proof. Christopher Skase had spent years mastering the first world. Now he was being dragged into the second, and it did not suit him. The deeper investigators, creditors, and journalists pushed, the clearer the pattern became. Quintex had not merely overreached in the ordinary corporate sense. It had created a world in which expansion itself helped postpone recognition of weakness. Rising asset values made borrowing easier. Borrowing funded more acquisitions. More acquisitions supported the aura of success. That aura encouraged further trust. And because each new layer seemed to validate the last one, the structure could look increasingly impressive precisely as its dependence intensified. That is what so many people failed to see in time. The empire was not strong in the way it appeared strong. It was sensitive, exquisitely sensitive, to sentiment, to refinancing, to continued belief. It depended on a future that had to keep arriving on schedule. As long as tomorrow looked generous, the system could breathe. The moment tomorrow became hostile, yesterday's triumphs started turning into today's liabilities. And then came the betrayal every such empire eventually faces. Time, not an enemy in a boardroom, not a prosecutor, not a political rival. Time, Because the more Quintex depended on rolling pressure forward, the more dangerous every passing week became. Obligations matured, support weakened. The markets no longer rewarded boldness the way they once had. Lenders who had enjoyed the upside of proximity to glamour now faced the possibility that they had mistaken spectacle for solvency. The shift was psychological before it became terminal. That matters. Once the mood changes around a financial empire, every ambiguity becomes sinister. Every delay feels tactical. Every confident statement sounds rehearsed. The same charisma that once attracted people begins to repel them, not because it has changed, but because the context has. What once sounded visionary now sounds evasive. What once looked fearless now looks cornered. Then the walls started closing in around Skase himself. The public story of the tycoon, the empire builder, the man too large for ordinary limits, began to mutate into something harsher. Questions about corporate weakness became questions about personal responsibility. Questions about judgment became questions about honesty. And hovering behind all of it was the darkest possibility of all. That the empire had not simply collapsed because it was too ambitious, but because its survival had come to depend on a reality that could never endure daylight for long. That was the true exposure. Not that Quintex had borrowed too much. Plenty of companies borrow too much. Not that Skase had lived extravagantly. Plenty of executives live extravagantly. It was that the public had confused visibility with transparency. Because Quintex was so visible, people assumed they understood it. Because Skase was so famous, people assumed he had been fully measured. Because the empire was so public, they assumed it could not be fundamentally opaque. They were wrong. And by the time that realization spread, the damage was no longer confined to balance sheets. Employees, investors, lenders, ordinary people, tied to the company's orbit. They were all now inside the consequences of a machine they had never fully seen. That is the cruelty of these collapses. The complexity protects the people at the top until very late in the story. Everyone else discovers the truth through impact. Then Skase made the story even darker. Because when pressure becomes unbearable, a man's final move often reveals more than all the years that came before it. In public, he had embodied command, certainty, momentum. But as legal, financial, and institutional consequences tightened around him, the image of mastery gave way to something else. Retreat, evasion, distance. The figure who had once dominated Australian corporate life began slipping physically and psychologically out of reach, as if disappearance itself could become a strategy. It was a pattern interrupt so sharp it changed the whole moral frame of the story. The empire had sold confidence. Its architect was now selling absence, and absence can be powerful. It can delay reckoning. It can complicate justice. It can turn a businessman into a fugitive symbol. A man suspended somewhere between illness, self-preservation, and calculated escape. The details around him became murky, contested, theatrical in their own way. But that murk only deepened the public sense that this had never been just a failed company. It was a spectacle that had collapsed into pursuit. By now, the hidden system was fully visible. An empire inflated by leverage, sustained by confidence, protected by complexity, confronted by a man whose greatest asset may not have been operational brilliance at all, but the ability to keep other people believing long enough for the next layer to be built. Quintex had not hidden its danger by being small and secretive. It had hidden its danger by being enormous and dazzling. That is why the warning came so late. That is why so many institutions stayed close for so long. And that is why the final break was going to be so violent. Because once the illusion could no longer be refinanced, all that remained was the question nobody had wanted to ask at the beginning. Who would be left holding the wreckage? And who, if anyone, would ever truly be forced to answer for it? And then it broke. Not cleanly, not nobly, not with the kind of a dramatic confession that lets a society believe it has learned its lesson in a single moment. It broke the way these empires usually break. Messily, expensively, with blame scattered across institutions, excuses multiplying in public, and ordinary people discovering too late that the grandeur they had been shown was never the same thing as safety. Quintex collapsed under the weight it had spent years disguising. The debt, the pressure, the dependence on confidence, the need for asset values, lender trust, and constant expansion to keep reinforcing each other. Once that circle failed, the glamour turned into dead weight. Towers and hotels and prestige no longer looked like proof of strength. They looked like monuments to a financial fantasy that had finally run out of time. And when the wreckage settled, the losses spread outward. Investors were burned, creditors were dragged into the fallout, employees and businesses tied to the empire's orbit were left dealing with consequences they had never designed and could not control. The public did what the public often does after a collapse like this. It searched for the single villain, the single moment, the single lie that would make the story feel containable. But stories like this are never that small. Yes, Christopher Skase was the face of the disaster, the symbol. The man who turned spectacle into strategy and status into a shield. The man who seemed to believe that enough confidence, enough motion, enough grandeur could keep reality itself at a distance. And in the final act, when accountability closed in, he became something even more revealing than a failed tycoon. He became proof that in certain financial systems, the most powerful players can convert wealth into delay, visibility into confusion, and notoriety into distance from judgment. That is, who gained power in the deepest sense. Not just Skase in his prime, but the culture that made him possible. A culture where lenders preferred momentum to caution, where prestige softened scrutiny, where public scale created private protection, where complexity gave everyone just enough plausible deniability to stay involved while the machine kept moving. That is the real lesson buried beneath the scandal. Christopher Skase did not emerge from nowhere. He was produced by an era that rewarded financial theater, celebrated excess as intelligence, and treated expansion as evidence instead of a question. Quintex was not simply one man's delusion imposed on an innocent system. It was a collaboration between ambition and appetite, between the performer at the center and the institutions that kept applauding because the show was profitable. And that is why this story still matters now. Because the costumes change, the accents change, the sectors change, property becomes tech, conglomerates become platforms, debt cycles become liquidity cycles, the language gets more sophisticated, the spreadsheets get denser, the branding gets cleaner. But the pattern survives. A charismatic figure appears. Complexity grows faster than understanding. Institutions suspend disbelief because the upside looks irresistible. The public confuses prominence with legitimacy. Warnings seem dull beside momentum. And by the time the structure is finally understood, the people who sold the dream have already taken what they needed from it. That is the coldest part of all. Financial collapse is rarely just about money. It is about permission. Who's permitted to appear credible without being clear? Who's permitted to move faster than scrutiny? Who is permitted to fail spectacularly while others absorb the cost? Christopher Skase became one of the darkest symbols of that permission, not because he invented the game, but because he played it so extravagantly that the underlying rules became impossible to ignore once everything fell apart. The empire died. The pattern did not. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.